Hey everyone, in this video I want to show you how we can take APIs to the next level. What we'll do is create an API, and whenever certain users access it, we'll give different responses depending on who they are. Let's dive in on how we can make this first, and then I'll show you how we can selectively choose users. Getting started, since I want to have an API, I need it to be hosted online. A good service to build this with is called wayscript. Wayscript allows us to host this, and something that isn't standard in a lot of other platforms, we can programmatically figure out who is accessing our endpoint. So we get user control right out of the box using wayscript. I'll click on new layer, and what this is doing is creating an environment that I can build my tool into. We'll say API example, but feel free to name yours whatever you want. So once we have that, we'll click on create, and that will build that dev environment for us. And it looks just like this. So what we need if we first want to create an API is we'll need some type of logic to figure out what to return to the user whenever they access an endpoint. A quick way to build APIs with Python is to use a framework called Flask. And how Flask works is it looks for an app.py file, which we will create in our file manager. And this will be what is loaded whenever we deploy our Flask application. Now that we have our app.py, what we'll need first is to import our dependencies. So we'll say from Flask, we'll import capital Flask and also request. We will initialize our application. I will copy this over. So now what we need to do if we want to create an API, we just need to accept when a user goes to a certain route and return information back to the user. So in Flask, what we can do is we have a decorated app.route, and inside this, we will put the endpoint that the user will go to get the information. So let's say that we want the user to go to the home page, which would just be this. Now we'll create a Python function, and we'll say something like home. Inside this function, we need to write some logic to return information back to the user. That may look something like return, and if we want to return this as an API response, we'll use curly brackets. We'll say something like data and data to return. And just like that, we have the bones of an API where a user goes to an endpoint and gets an API response. This is very simple right now, but you could imagine that you wanted to add logic to query a database, to read off a file that you may have in your file manager, or many more things. And now let's talk about the second part of this video. In the intro, I said we want to be able to give different information to different users depending on some information about them. Wayscript has a user management system already built in, so this is very simple with them, and I'll show you how we can do it with Wayscript. So to do that, there is a Wayscript Python library. We will import something called context, and this will just give us context about the user accessing our application. There is a little bit of code in their documentation that I will pull in, and we'll go through it. So what happens is we can use this function that we're creating, get user details. So that allows us to pull out user information such as first name, last name, email, and also Wayscript specific information such as groups, which they have built in. So now what we want to do is let's selectively choose a user to return information to. Let's say that we want our endpoint to be able to identify people who are logged in and people who are not. We'll say try. And then we'll say user equals get user details. So what that means is if a user goes to our endpoint, we will first try to see if they're logged in. If they are not, then we might want to do something like accept, and then we'll just return data user not logged in. Now that we figured out that the user is logged in, we might want a different response for ourselves than the response that we give to everybody else. So let's handle the response that we would give to everybody else first. So we'll say if user, so we're getting information from our context here. If user, we'll use a method called get, and we will get the user's email. If user email does not equal the email of myself, which is Derek@wayscript.com, then I will say something in the return. So return data and then hello user. Perfect. So now we want to handle the case where else. So this would be when I access this API endpoint. we will say return data, hello, Derek. This may not seem too powerful at the moment, but with just a few lines of code, we can identify different users accessing our API and give different responses depending on who they are. We're just returning simple strings at the moment, but like I said earlier, we could be doing a lot more with each of these. I just wanted to show you the backbone of how we could create a selective API. So after all of this is said, the reason why we're building this in wayscript in the first place is so we can host it very easily. So you saw me click .triggers on the left, and now I'm going to create a new trigger. Their trigger system is a way in which we can automate certain tasks and that we can deploy services like we're building in this video. So to deploy a service like we have here, there's a little bit of code that I will post in the description. The command to run will be this. So on the back end of what's happening in wayscript is that all of these are running inside of a Docker container, and we need to expose the endpoints outwards outside of the Docker container. And we can do that by saying Flask run. We're exposing it using this host number. Now that we have all of that, we'll match the port, so 880, and now we can click test. Thankfully, with the wayscript logs, we see that I made a mistake when setting up the application. It is name instead of app here. So now we'll go back to the triggers and we will try again. So this time, hopefully it works, and we can go and view our endpoint. And as you see, we get the user specific to myself, data, hello, Derek. Awesome. So we have a dev endpoint now. I want to show you one last thing, and we can deploy this to a prod state. So we can deploy by clicking the button on the left. We will deploy. And what this does is give us a production environment API where you can make changes in your dev one and always have a prod endpoint available for people to hit. So we will go to that one and make sure it's still working, and it does. So if you have any questions about any of this in this video, please let me know and I'll be happy to help. But hopefully you see how powerful this is, and hopefully you can get it working for your own cool project ideas. Until next time.